The point is, the paper topics ought to be intellectually challenging. You ought to feel both that they enable you to show your mastery of the material in the course and do some intellectual work on your own, do some independent thinking. Okay, is there anything else I need to announce? Well, then let's just go to work. We're still struggling with the so-called mind-body problem and with basically what I call mainstream philosophy of mind. And there are a bunch of questions in mainstream philosophy of mind, that some of which we haven't approached yet much at all. One of them is the problem of free will, and we will talk about that. But I have to give you a theory of intentionality first. Now, I'd like, maybe today, but in the next couple of lectures, to finish mainstream philosophy of mind so that I could start talking about what I think is really the important part of the course, namely how does the mind work. And the essential notion there is the notion of intentionality, the capacity that we have to represent objects and states of affairs in the world through perception, memory, belief, desire, intention. The emotions are something we haven't talked about yet, and I'd like to at least give, one lecture or a chunk of a lecture about the emotions, because I think you won't really understand the nature of the mind if you don't understand the emotions. Okay, so last time I started talking about the structure of intentionality, but in my eagerness to get to what I think is the more fun part of the course, I left out various things that I should have discussed, and I'm going to fill in with those, and then we're going to go back and pick up the discussion of consciousness. One thing that I did not talk about were some current theories of mind that seem to me so implausible that I'm astounded that anybody can take them seriously. But anyway, there are well-known philosophers who hold these views, so let me tell you some of what they are. One view that is going around now, I think if you came back in 10 years, you wouldn't hear any more about it because it'll die of its own preposterousness. But that has a name. It's called the theory of the extended mind. And the idea is this. Suppose functionalism were right. Suppose a mental state just consists in sets of causal relations between input stimuli and output behavior. Well, if you're interested in the causal mechanisms that mediate input stimuli and output behavior, then why stop with the brain? Why stop with the skin? There are all sorts of mechanisms in the world that enable you to facilitate the relationship between the input stimuli and the output behavior. Why aren't they part of your mind? I actually made sort of lecture notes today, more than I normally make, because it's kind of a long list of stuff I want to talk about. Why aren't the lecture notes part of my mind? And these guys say, well, if you take functionalism seriously, they are part of your mind. This is actually a piece of my mind on the extended mind theory. So the extended mind theory says the mind is extended. All sorts of things are parts of the mind, provided they are part of the causal relations between the input stimuli and the external behavior. So your computer is part of your mind. This piece of chalk, I guess, is part of my mind. Now, I think that view is preposterous. It would have the consequence, for example, that when I tear up this piece of paper, I'm tearing up a piece of my mind. Or if my computer is stolen, a piece of my mind is stolen. And I think that's not how it works. I think, to put it in very crude terms, the brain is rather special. The brain plays a special role in the mind, in that all of our mental states go on in the brain, and any theory of the mind has to explain the nature of what is going on in the brain that enables us to call certain of those processes mental and others of those processes not mental. So I don't take the extended mind seriously, but if you Google extended mind or look in the Stanford Encyclopedia, I haven't done this, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which incidentally is largely supported by the Berkeley Library, But incidentally, if you look in those places, you'll find accounts of the extended mind. If there's anybody who wants to defend the extended mind, now's your chance. I mean, if you think there's anything in it. So any questions about the extended, I'm not going to say more about it, except to say I think it's not a serious project. On the other hand, many views about the mind are equally preposterous. And they get, one is panpsychism, that everything is conscious. Another is, well, as you know, behaviorism that says, well, really there isn't any mental life going on in there. There's just an output behavior. So I don't know that the extended mind leads the league, that it's the champion of preposterous theories of the mind, but it's certainly one of the challengers. Yes?
Well, I guess I don't really subscribe to functionalism, so I don't really believe that tools can possibly be part of the mind.
Yeah.
But I think you point out something very interesting about the fact that we can't have certain thoughts without having certain tools.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I just, for the people at the back of the room, he says, but it's certainly the case that you can't have certain sorts of thoughts without certain kinds of tools. And I would want to say the essential tool is language. There are all sorts of thoughts that my poor dog Gilbert simply cannot have because he hasn't got language. It isn't just that he can't worry about whether or not he'll get his income tax in on time this year, but he can't even worry about what he's going to do next Wednesday because he hasn't got the apparatus to represent next Wednesday. He hasn't got the linguistic apparatus. So I don't want to give you the impression that what I'm arguing for when I say mental states go on inside your brain, that I'm arguing for a kind of solipsism, that the whole of reality is inside your brain, or that all of the contents of what's inside your brain can be entirely fixed without reference to any external objects. That's not the case. No, much of your mental life depends on your abilities to cope with the world, and those go beyond what is actually encoded in your brain at any given moment. So, for example, I want to go skiing this weekend, but a look at the weather prediction says no chance. I mean, they're absolutely brutal. I just looked before class, and it said, if you're planning any trips over the Sierra, don't do it until after Saturday afternoon. So they're pretty mean now. In the old days, they used to say, well, it's a winter storm warning. God knows, it's your responsibility. Now they actually actively discourage you. So this is a case where my mental life is severely affected by information that I get from my computer. And you can give thousands of examples in daily life. Any other questions about the extended mind? As Gil Harman says somewhere, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. Remember, modus ponens goes if P then Q, P therefore Q, and modus tollens go if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. So modus ponens says, well, if functionalism is true, and it is true, they think, then the extended mind is true. Functionalism is true, so the extended mind is true. The other guys, of which I'm one, says the extended mind is false. If functionalism is true, then the extended mind is true, but the extended mind is false. Therefore, functionalism is false. One side gives modus ponens, the other guy gives modus tollens, and that's much of the history of philosophy is like that. One philosopher's result is another philosopher's refutation. Yes, there's a guy at the back with a hand up. Yeah. No, the point is not about the nature of cooperation or universal minds. I don't think there are universal minds. All mental life is in the heads of individuals, humans and animals. Maybe someday we'll be able to invent a conscious machine, but we're nowhere near doing that so far. Nobody's been able to invent anything like a conscious machine. The question is there some reason to say that the body and especially the brain have a privileged role in mental life, that all of my mental life goes on inside my brain and maybe other parts of my nervous system, but certainly inside my skin. I think that's right, that it does go on inside my brain. But there is the single most influential view in the philosophy of mind is probably some kind of functionalism. And according to functionalism, some people have recently discovered, well, on the functionalist account, it seems arbitrary to set the boundary of the mind at the skin, at the boundary of your body. Because if the mind is essentially a matter of causal relations, those causal relations extend beyond your body. And as I say, the mental phenomena don't extend beyond your body. And that's a refutation of functionalism. But if you're convinced of functionalism, then you might think that what I'm calling a refutation is in fact a discovery. Okay, now there's another crazy view, I'm sorry to use these technical terms, and that's panpsychism, that everything is mental, that a piece of paper is mental and a piece of chalk is conscious and so on. And it's very hard to get people to come out and endorse panpsychism, but I think Dave Chalmers is committed to it, at least in a hesitant fashion, and he does in his book describe what it would feel like to be a thermostat. He thinks the thermostat is conscious, or that it could be conscious, and he wants it to feel like to be a thermostat. Now, I think if you can take that seriously, you have real problems. But in any case, the problem with one of the many problems with panpsychism is you can't give a coherent statement of it. Why? Because consciousness, by definition, comes in units. And remember, I told you on Tuesday that it's a feature of consciousness that it always comes in unified conscious fields. So if you're going to say the thermostat is conscious, what about the parts of the thermostat? Why the thermostat and not each screw in the thermostat, or the bimetallic strip in the thermostat? Or if you're going to say the thermostat, why not the whole heating system of which the thermostat is a part? Or if you're going to say the heating system, why not the whole building? So I don't think there is a coherent statement of panpsychism. I think it's a kind of, to put it crudely, a kind of intellectual laziness. That people say, well, maybe consciousness is everywhere. It's sort of spread over the universe like so much jam. And the problem with that is not just that it's false, but that you cannot give a coherent statement of it, because you can't give a coherent statement that's consistent with what we know about about consciousness coming in unified fields. Okay, so that's one problem that I should have mentioned earlier and I didn't, but anyway, now I've done that. Now another one is that there are a class of philosophers, not very many, but there are some philosophers who say we can't solve the mind-body problem. We can never understand how brains relate to consciousness. Even if it's right that brains cause consciousness, we can never understand how it works. Well, I guess the leading spokesman for this view is Colin McGinn, who says that we cannot have a theory of the relation of mind and body. For us, he says, it's noumenal, using Kant's expression for the unknowable things in themselves. Yes, there is a causal relation between the brain and the mind, but it's unknowable to us. The problem with that is, even if it were true, we couldn't now say that it's true, because in order to set the bounds to knowledge, you'd have to be able to think both sides of the boundary. And it ought to interest people that no neuroscientists working on this problem would just say, well, it's a mystery. We'll never understand it. I mean, if we know that brain processes cause consciousness, we know that this happens, and we know that the brain is something you can investigate like any other organ, then it looks like we ought to get busy and investigate it. Maybe we're not going to succeed. It's like discovering a cure for cancer. We don't have a cure for cancer, but that doesn't mean, and maybe we never will, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue the investigation, that there's some theoretical reason for not continuing the investigation. A weaker form of Mysterianism is the view in Thomas Nagel's article. It was, I think, a very good article. I referred to it many times, of what it's like to be a bad article. And there he says, with our present conceptual apparatus, we can't understand how brain processes could cause mental states. Well, once again, I think if you say that, you're too much in the grip of Cartesianism. You think there's some unbridgeable gulf. But suppose we actually had a perfect science of the brain. Suppose we could actually know how, not just how brain processes cause us to be conscious, but we know in detail how the experience of red, the conscious experience of seeing something red, is caused by processes in the brain. We had a theory of that. We have a theory of why certain processes cause certain types of mental states and other processes don't. We had a theory, let's say, comparable to the germ theory of disease, where we have a theory of how microorganisms cause disease symptoms. Then it would seem to me that would answer the Mysterions. And I don't think anybody except a Cartesian could say, well, you don't really understand it because you don't see how to get over the metaphysical gulf from the brain to from the brain to consciousness. And I think, again, the history of life, the history of the study of life is revealing here. People used to think that the existence of life was a deep mystery, and that you could never explain it by mechanical causes, by standard chemical causes. And there was a huge dispute. It may have gone on in this very building. I don't know when it was built, but it was built quite a long time ago. Between people called mechanists, who thought there's a mechanical explanation of life, and others called vitalists. And the vitalists, vitalism, the vitalists thought you have to postulate a vital spirit. And certain kinds of nonsense sound a lot better in French. You have to have an élan vital. And the élan vital distinguishes living organisms, living matter from non-living matter. Today, it's interesting, it's very hard for us to feel what drove these people. We don't feel the passion that they felt. This was a passionate debate. People felt very strongly about mechanism versus vitalism. Now, I don't have to tell you, the mechanists won the argument, because we now understand the mechanisms that produce life, and we understand a whole lot of things that were simply not understood at the 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, much less 150 years ago in the 19th century. So if we had the kind of explanation of consciousness that we have of life, of what it is for an organism to be alive, then I think the sense that there's some deep mystery about mind-body relations would simply disappear. And the point is not just that the mechanists won and the vitalists lost, but we got a much richer conception of the nature of biochemistry. We understand things about carbon-based molecules, about organic chemistry, which would have stunned people in the middle of the 19th century. We just know a whole lot more. So we have a much richer conception of the mechanisms involved. We no longer talk mysteriously about how heredity works. We can actually identify the mechanisms in DNA and RNA molecules. Indeed, according to Francis Crick, we don't really have much use for the notion of a gene anymore because we mostly deal with molecular biochemistry, and there are courses in this university where you can learn the details of that. If we had that kind of knowledge about consciousness, I think the philosophical problem would simply disappear, and I don't see any reason in principle why we can't have it. It took a long time, much longer than the mechanists expected it to take to get an understanding of life, but we now have it. By the way, one of the things that really drove me crazy when I was an undergraduate, when I was your age, is by and large the professors didn't tell us what they didn't know. They were so anxious to say what they did know that they didn't tell you what they didn't know. And when I took a course in biology, nobody told us that they didn't know how heredity worked. Well, they didn't. It wasn't until Francis Crick and Jim Watson discovered that DNA was the mechanism that we began really to understand it. Okay, now I want to tell you flatly, we don't understand how the brain works. We understand a fair amount about the anatomy and physiology. In fact, we're getting a whole lot better understanding of the basic chemical structure of the neurotransmitters and about the nature of synaptic transmission and about what is happening in the synaptic cleft. We know a lot of that stuff now, but we don't know the crucial answers to the crucial questions, such as how exactly does the brain produce consciousness? Now, we don't even know how exactly does the brain store memories. We're learning a lot about that, and one of the things that's interesting is we now have a much richer conception of memory. So all kinds of distinctions are made between iconic memory and working memory and event memory and declarative memory, which previous theorists wouldn't have been able to make. They didn't know enough of the neurobiology to make those. And when we talk about intentionality, I'll have more to say about brain research. But I don't see any obstacle in principle to having an understanding of how brains cause consciousness. So I'm not a Mysterion. I mention that because I frequently see myself referred to as a Mysterion because I reject the computational theory of the mind. Oh, incidentally, I have to tell you, that article came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, and I actually had to go to a dinner party last night and I actually saw the damned article for about 30 seconds, but I didn't get a chance to read it. But have a look at it. You can probably find it on the web. And the email has started to come in, and one of the things that I liked best was some outraged doctor wrote me and said, "Why do you waste your time writing this article? We all know that. Of course the computer can't think." He thought that everybody agreed with my conclusion. He hasn't been in this debate for the past 30 years. But in any case, I was delighted that some people think, the point is so obvious. Why are you making it? And I wrote back and told him I only did it at the insistence of the Wall Street Journal. Okay, shall we go on? I'm going to abandon extended mind and Mysterions and mention another thing I left out. Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah. Mechanism was opposed to vitalism, and what they meant by mechanism was not that they knew the nature of the mechanism, but they thought an explanation of life would have to be given in mechanistic terms, that is to say, in chemical and physical terms. And that's what happened. You wouldn't need to postulate something outside of the physical chemical world, some spirit, some vital spirit, which this was called, the élan vital that came from outside the physical world to explain life. And I'm saying you don't need some spiritual explanation to explain consciousness. We're going to have an explanation in neurobiological terms where that goes on. Now, I told you on my theory, on what I call biological naturalism, the view of consciousness that I gave you, there are certain depressing results. And one is, when you die, your consciousness is going to cease. I'm sorry about that, but as far as I can tell, that is how it in fact works. Another thing that I should tell you, a lot of people think is a counterintuitive result, and maybe it is. On my account, if you have a pain in your toe, strictly speaking, the location of the actual event of your feeling the pain is not in your toe, it's in your brain. And the phantom limb phenomena are good examples of this. I'm sorry to give you these horrible stories, but anyway, they're the ones that illustrate the case. A guy has his leg cut off because he gets in an accident. He's run over by a train or something like that. But after his leg has been amputated, he still reports feelings of pain in his toe. This is known as the phantom limb phenomenon. And I, to this day, still get letters from people saying, "My uncle has phantom limb pains. What can you do about it?" As if, I'm going to be able to help him out. I'm not. And the point on my account is everybody understands why. What happens is the nerve endings that stimulate the pain in the toe are still being stimulated even after the toe is gone. And consequently, the guy does sincerely feel a pain, and he sincerely reports that the pain is in his toe, but he hasn't got a toe. Now, on my account, that's perfectly possible. The way it works is the brain creates a body image. If you look in standard neurobiology textbooks, they usually show you this huge homunculus in your brain where the body, where you experience different parts of your body in the body image, which is in the brain. So it's a real event that occurs when you have a pain in the toe, but the actual physical location of that physical event is in your brain and not in your toe, and that seems right to me. There's a sense in which all of us, well, I won't say all of us, but a lot of us have phantom limb pains. A very common ailment, which if you don't have it, you probably will someday, it's called sciatica. And in the case of sciatica, the patient feels a shooting pain that goes down his leg, but there's nothing wrong with his leg. His leg is fine. The sciatic nerve in his spine is stimulated, and that gives him the experience of a pain in his leg, but there's nothing going on in the leg. It's all in the brain. So on my account, to put it paradoxically, really all bodily sensations are phantom limb sensations. They're all going on in the brain. Now, that doesn't mean that when I go to my doctor and he said, well, where exactly do you feel a pain? I don't say here. No, I point to my toe where I actually feel a pain, because that's where he's got to carry out the treatment. And that is the phenomenology of it. That's how it actually feels. But if we take the experience of pain as an event occurring in space-time, which it is, then the actual spatial location of that event is not in the toe, but it's in the brain. This is why aspirin and other analgesics work. They work on the pain centers in the brain to make the pain go away. Okay, so I want to point that out to you, because a lot of people think that's a counterintuitive result, and it is counterintuitive to say, well, the actual, strictly speaking, the location of the pain in the toe, if you take that experience as an event, a real event occurring in the real world, it occurs in my brain. Yes? Who more? The Mysterions?
They agree with you that...
Well, Mysterions think consciousness exists, but they think we'll never be able to understand it. I mean, they're not materialists. I mean, I'm talking about Colin McGinn more than anybody else, because he's the sort of the leading Mysterion. And he doesn't deny that consciousness exists, and he really doesn't deny that it's caused by brain process. He thinks it is. He just thinks we can never understand it. For us, it will forever be a mystery. Yeah.
Never understand it on a third person, from a third person perspective. So
well, you see, you can understand what we need to understand from a third person perspective. You can understand how these experiences how these neurobiological events cause these experiences. Now, there may be forms of the experience that we will never be able to have empathy with, because it's so different from our own. So, I mean, to take Nagel's example, we may never have a full understanding of what it's like to be a bat, because we don't know what it would feel like to live the bat's life. Or I give the example of the bird that navigates by detecting the Earth's magnetic field. What's it like to feel a surge of magnetism coming up in your chest? I don't know. But we may still be able to figure out what are the neurobiological mechanisms that produce those experiences. And for science, that's enough. I mean, that's pretty good if we could do that. Okay, shall we go on then? So we've dealt with the extended mind, the Mysterions. Now there's one other thing that I should mention before I go back and talk about consciousness, which is what I really want to talk about. And that is the accusation made against me by Jaegwon Kim prominently, but other people have made it as well. And it's useful to have these slogans. It's called causal over-determination. Now, what Kim says is, on my account, if there's a neurobiological cause of my arm going up and a mental cause of my arm going up, and there's no ontological reduction of the mental to the neurobiological, then you have too many causes. So what caused my arm to go up? Well, my intention and action. I decided to raise my arm, and my decision led to the trying, as another name for the intention and action, to raise my arm, and it went up. That's a mental story about how the mental caused the physical. But at the same time, there's a neurobiological story, and I won't tell you the whole damn story about what happens in the motor cortex and how it goes down to the motor neurons and how eventually it reaches the axon end plates of the motor neurons where they latch onto the muscle fiber, and then you get all of these marvelous things happening in the muscle fiber, and eventually it ratchets up with the myosin filaments and the actin filaments. You find it in any physiology textbook. There's a story about how muscles move when you, for example, raise your arm. Okay, now says Kim, on Searle's account, you got too many causes. And indeed, if you look at the diagram that I continue to draw, where you have the intention and action causing the bodily movement, and you have a whole lot of neurophysiology, which also causes the physiological changes, then it looks like you got a cause down here. This is a cause, and this is a cause, but this is a single event here of my arm going up, but it looks like you have causal overdetermination. You have a neurophysiological cause and intention and action cause. Okay, well, you know my answer to that, but I want to repeat it because it's crucial to the whole argument of the course. Namely, these are not two events. They're one event with two levels of description. There's a level of description where there's my conscious decision going on, and another level of description where that is grounded in. It is caused by and realized in, by bottom-up causation, a whole lot of neurophysiological processes going on in the same way that the bodily movement is grounded in a whole lot of physiological processes going on. It's just that this one has this remarkable feature at the top level. It's got subjectivity, which you do not have as an ontological feature down here. But remember, and this is the key to this whole discussion, consciousness is entirely causally reducible to brain processes. There's no separate causal force to consciousness any more than there is to solidity or any other higher level feature. But the causal reducibility does not lead to ontological reducibility for a really kind of trivial reason, namely, the first-person ontology of the subjective cannot be entirely eliminated in favor of the third-person ontology of the objective. Now, I'm talking in slogans, but I've taught you what these slogans mean about ontological objectivity and ontological subjectivity. So it's because consciousness is ontologically subjective that you can't do the reduction to the neurobiology, but there's no causal power to consciousness, which is not I realized in the neurobiology. Any feature of your conscious state is entirely caused by neurobiological processes. So I don't take Kim's account seriously, but like all of these accounts, it rests on taking the Cartesian categories as being adequate, and they're not. The mental and the physical are simply inadequate, as traditionally conceived, inadequate to describe the phenomena. And I gave you an odd kind of proof of the reverse, where I said, look, there's no question my intention caused my arm to go up, but anything that caused my arm to go up that way has to cause the secretion of a very specific neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, one of my favorite neurotransmitters. I have others I like better, but that's a good one. Dopamine. Well, I won't tell you about dopamine. That's another lecture. But the intention and action causes the arm to go up, and the intention and anything that causes the arm to go up has to cause the secretion of acetylcholine. And only a neurobiological feature could cause the secretion of acetylcholine. So what's the answer to that? Not that we have too many causes, no, but the intention and action is a neurobiological phenomenon with neurobiological properties. It's got neurobiological properties describable down here and mental properties describable up here. One event with both sets of properties, and they are not observer relative, either one of them. They're both intrinsic. They're both observer independent. Okay, so I'm not dismayed by the objection that Kim makes. I couldn't find my copy of his book, but I'm sure we can track it down. Yeah, Jim.
So I'm confused about this picture. So there's one event with two different causes.
Yes, and this is true of car engines, is my favorite example because I understand how it works. The car engine has one event that's describable either as the passage of electrons across the electrodes or the spark plug firing. Those are one event with two different levels of description. It has another event which is caused by the spark plug firing, which is an explosion in the cylinder. And that event is describable either as the oxidization of hydrocarbon molecules or the explosion in the cylinder as the engine fires. It's exactly like the mind-body problem, except, of course, with the fact that in the case of consciousness, you get ontological subjectivity. Yes?
And is this the same relation that's also causal between the brain causing, in other words, is that?
Yes, okay. Now, on my account, you get bottom-up causation pretty much throughout everything. And the objection that people make to that is, well, you can't have a causal relation if you have an identity relation. And there I think that's wrong. You can have a causal relation within a system. So, for example, the solidity of this desk will causally account for its, well, except the damn thing rolls around too much, will causally account for the fact that it supports my keys or anything else I put on it. Now, what's the whole causal story? The causal story is the vibratory movement of the molecules in lattice structures causally accounts for impenetrability. If I hold these things out here and let go of them, they'll fall to the ground. Molecules in both places. This one pile of molecules, this another pile of molecules. The molecules here have a causal property that these molecules don't have. And that causal property is explained by the behavior of the molecule movements. Now, I want to say it's exactly like that with this example, except with this exceptional feature, which is what makes life fun. Namely, we have this ontological subjectivity. Say some more. Yeah.
So, just to be sure, is it true to say then that the event at one level of description causes the same event at another?
Yes, it's a bit tricky because, I'll state this point precisely. Once you get a causal reduction, our standard practice has been to make an ontological reduction by way of redefinition. So before we know any chemistry, solidity is defined as resistance to touch and pressure, maintenance of the same bodily shape, stability of a certain kind. Those are part of the definition of solidity. Now then, once you get an explanation of those surface phenomena, you redefine solidity in terms of the micro explanation. The micro features cause the macro surface features. Instead of defining solidity in terms of the macro surface features, you define it now in terms of the micro features. But the causal relations remain exactly the same. So instead of saying, this thing supports objects because it's solid, we now say the causal relations between the molecule movements and the molecular structure of the object placed on it make it the case that you've got an explanation of why it supports objects placed on it. This impenetrability now has a causal explanation. Now, it might look, as if, that's trivial. Okay, so you redefine the notion. But it has amazing results. And the single most amazing result is you can now discover things that you couldn't discover otherwise. Namely, you can discover that glass is a liquid. Why? Because the molecules aren't moving the way they move in the case of other solids. It's just a liquid that flows very, very slowly, like you'd have to wait around for millions of years for the glass and these glass panels to move. So that redefinition is not trivial. Now let me make one last thought here, and then I'll take you. The ontological reduction on the basis of a causal reduction, why can't we do that with consciousness? And the answer is we might. We might get so good at brain science that we would say things like, look, this guy really has a pain, but he can't feel it yet. We can see on the brainoscope that he's got a pain, but he can't feel it yet. Eventually he'll feel it, but he doesn't feel it yet. We might redefine the pain in terms of the micro causes in the way we redefine solidity in terms of the micro causes. But if we did that, you'd still need a concept to describe the ontological subjectivity. So I'm convinced that part of our problem in appreciating this is we know too much about the history of philosophy. We're still wrapped in the Cartesian terminology. We still think, well, if it's mental, it can't be physical. And then the worst mistake then is to go the next step and say, well, the world contains not only the mental and the physical, but it's got a third realm. Frege said that, Popper says it, Jürgen Habermas said it in lectures in Berkeley. So worse than dualism, you got trialism, that there are three realms that we live in. That's all a mistake. There's one world, we all live in one world, and it's got all kinds of oddball features, and part of the fun of philosophy is you get to explore those features. But anyway, you had a question.
Yeah, okay, so we're saying that there are two levels of description.
Yes.
Right, similar to the car example.
Yeah.
But in the car example, it seems that we can ontologically reduce the first
Yes,
level of description to the second.
you can reduce the firing of the spark plugs to the electrons passing between the electrodes. You can reduce the explosion in the cylinder to the oxidization of the hydrocarbon molecules. But, and I want to say, you can also reduce the consciousness to the neurophysiology, but the reduction there is causal, not ontological. You can't make the ontological reduction on the base of the causal reduction in a way that you can with the others, because if you did that, you'd lose the point of having the concept of consciousness. You'd still need something to name ontological subjectivity. Now, if somebody says, well, how the hell can that be? You're giving up the whole materialist worldview. Why did Galileo suffer if you're going to just chuck it out the window this way? Well, I think, no, I'm not chucking anything out the window. I'm just recognizing this is how the world works. And people who say, yeah, but, it's easy to imagine the world without consciousness. Yeah, it is, but that's not the world we live in. The world we live in contains consciousness. I've got it. So do you. Yes.
So we can do this ontological reduction in virtue of the two sets of properties that we said intention and action has.
Yeah.
Right? So is that what, for example, critics would use to say that's property dualism?
Yeah, people accuse me of property dualism, and they think, well, look, it's obviously property dualism because you say consciousness is not reducible to brain processes, but it's a feature of the brain at a higher level. That's the definition of property dualism. But then comes the crucial difference, and they say, but once you say that, you've said that consciousness is not a part of the physical world, and consequently it can't function causally. Or if it does function causally, you'd get a causal overdetermination. Either you get epiphenomenalism, or you get causal overdetermination. Epiphenomenalism says this level here makes no difference at all. All of the work is done at this level. Or overdetermination says you got too many causes. It can't be right because you got two independent causes. I want to say both of those answers show that we're still in the grip of the Cartesian categories. And we ought to be suspicious of these little parallelograms that I've been drawing. And maybe a much better, I've put those in print, so I'm stuck with those for a while. But maybe a much better picture is this. Instead of the metaphor and the higher and the lower, think of this big system moving forward, and it's got these neurons in it. And sometimes the neurons are in a certain state, in the same way that the water molecules are in a certain state. And then we're not struck by the difference in the lower and the higher, which gives us the idea, well, maybe consciousness is sort of like the varnish on the top of the table. It's higher up, but lower down is the real molecular structure. Now, what I'm trying to say now is maybe we should think that there's a whole system that moves in time, and it's got a microstructure. And there's a micro explanation of the macro phenomena as there is in everything, as there is in tables and car engines and all the rest of it. And the micro explanation of the macro phenomena in this case is that neuron firings cause consciousness, and consciousness qua consciousness continues to function causally in the same way that solidity qua solidity functions causally. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but in any case, this is an argument. I'm sure I'm gonna win this one. I won the Chinese room, but it took me 30 goddamn years. You wouldn't think it'd take that long. But anyway, I won't live to see this one, but I'm pretty confident this has to be the way it works, because we know this independently. We know independently all this stuff is caused by neuron firings in the brain. Presumably, you got to have a certain number of neurons. You can't do it with just oddball neurons, or even probably 100,000 neurons. Though who knows? That's a factual question. We can't settle it philosophically. Okay, other questions? Candida.
You know that you reduce causally consciousness to neurophysiology.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So how can you explain that intentional action causes bodily movement?
Yes. Well, okay. First of all, let's establish that it does. If you do philosophy long enough, you'll get a sore arm. But my urge is, and whenever I have doubts, yep, sure enough, the damn thing goes up. So there isn't any question about that. But that's like saying the spark plug firing causes the engine to turn over, or the explosion in the cylinder causes the piston to move. But now I can do a causal reduction of that, because there aren't any causes of my consciousness that don't have a neurobiological base. If they were not grounded in the plumbing, they couldn't move the arm. The arm, after all, is an object in the physical world like any other, and it's got to have certain sorts of mechanisms operating in order for it to move. Those mechanisms happen to be both describable at a mental level and at a neurobiological level. And maybe we should just get rid of this whole vocabulary of the mental and the physical. The trouble is, the other vocabularies that I know kicking around aren't any better. So I'm kind of stuck with a traditional vocabulary. I mean, I don't find it helpful to say, well, it's really the Befindlichkeit and Geworfenheit of Dasein in its struggle with the Lebenswelt. That's a Heideggerian jargon. And that doesn't help me much. I don't get any clarity out of that. So I'm stuck with the traditional vocabulary. And by and large, what I'm telling you, I have no problem explaining this to neuroscientists. Yeah, they think, okay, what's the big deal about that? They agree with all of that, though it took them a long time to agree to it. Yes?
So in your account, you have intentional action. There's a single event
Yes.
with two levels of description.
Well, actually, many levels. Yeah,
All
but
right,
go ahead.
multiple
Yeah.
levels of description, but there's really only a single cause.
There's a single cause moving the whole system forward.
Yeah, I
Right.
understand. Okay, and sometimes you can have the identical action, putting up my arm,
Yeah.
when I didn't intend to cause it. I have flavor.
That's right. Yeah.
So how would I describe that?
Well, okay. There are cases where my arm moves without me having an intention in action. Let's suppose that somebody simply stimulates the neurons in such a way that the arm goes up. You can. The standard experiments here are Penfield's. Penfield was a neurosurgeon in Montreal, and he was the best brain stabber like for 1,000 miles around. You had something wrong with your brain, you went to him. And I never met him, but I met his sidekick Rasmussen, and I had some conversations with him about these phenomena. It's very interesting. Now, Penfield did an interesting series of operations on people that involved opening up their brains. And if you look at the photographs, they're horrible because they shave all the guy's hair off and then they cut a sort of window in the skull and they take out a piece of the skull. This was brought home to me because my brother had a brain operation, and I called the doctor, and the doctor, it turned out, was kind of a fan of mine. He'd read things by me, and he thought, he mistakenly thought I knew a whole lot about the neurophysiology, which I don't know. My level of knowledge is that of an undergraduate neurobiology textbook. And he told me what he did to Billy Boy in horrendous detail. The operation was a success. My brother's okay now. But he began by saying, well, first we cut his skull off. Well, okay, I didn't want to go. I just stopped listening at that point. But anyway, yeah, they did cut his skull off, and then they glued it back on. Okay, well, that's good. I'm glad of that. But anyway, what Penfield did was he cut windows in the skull, and then he goes in with a micro electrode, and what he does is he says, I have caused a patient's arm to move I've caused a limb to move by stimulating portions of the motor cortex with a micro electrode. So he's got his little gimmick, and he touches the portion of the motor cortex. The patients are fully awake, and the guy's arm goes up. Now, says Penfield, when I have done this to a patient, I invariably ask the patient about it. And you think, you better ask him about it. You're messing around inside the guy's brain. And invariably the patient says, I didn't do that. You did it. It's easy to imagine what it's like. You're just sitting there, the guy, or lying there, the guy's messing around inside your brain, and suddenly your arm just goes up. You don't move it. You don't do it. He does it. And another creepy case is that he says, I have caused a patient to vocalize. He stimulates the auditory portions of the motor cortex. And invariably the patient says, I didn't say that. I didn't make that sound. You pulled it out of me. Notice the metaphors here. Now, he doesn't say what noises these people make. I imagine they don't sing the Canadian national anthem when he's stimulating their brain, but they probably go, or something like that. And the interesting thing is, it's without the intention in action. So what you have here is you have the bodily movement part without the intention in action. The way it actually goes, and when we talk about intentionality, I'll go through this, typically you form a prior intention. That leads to the intention in action, which another word for this is trying, and the intention in action causes the bodily movement, and this whole thing is the action. Now, what happens in Penfield's case is he's found a way that he can come in at this point and create the bodily movement without the intention in action. Now, nobody's been able to do this experiment where the guy says, I don't know why, but for some damn fool reason I'm raising my arm. I don't know why I'm raising my arm, I'm just raising it. That would be the case where you stimulate the brain at the point where the guy has the intention in action. As far as I know, nobody's been able to do that. Or the prior intention, the intention you have prior to the action. In that case, the guy would say, for some reason I made up my mind to move my arm. I don't know why, I just made up my mind to move my arm. That would be where you created the prior intention. Nobody's been able to do that either. And I think the reason is because these aren't local. See, this part is pretty well localized in the brain. It has to be to get very specific bodily movements. But you can have intentions in all kinds of ways in the brain. It's not, you don't get a nice type correlation with intentions that you do with the proximate causes of the bodily movement. Okay, there's a guy at the very back. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, no, okay, you didn't. All right, you've already had a chance. Anybody else who didn't have a chance to speak? Do you want to speak again? Yes. Yeah, well, that's a bigger problem. I mean, no question. Now we're talking now about conscious agents who are busy acting intentionally, and we want to know, how does it work? How is it possible that in a unified reality, which consists entirely in physical particles, conscious agents can move their bodies by making conscious decisions and then trying to carry out those decisions? And I think there is the formal structure of that answer is rather simple. That's the one I've given you. Now, the details of how it works in the neurobiology, that's much tougher. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know the answer to how the brain creates consciousness, and we don't know the answer to the question how it creates this specific form of consciousness. The second question may be easier to answer than the first, actually, because of we now have imaging techniques which enable us to localize in the brain certain kinds of things that are going on. Do you have your hand up now? Yeah. It isn't. That's the point I'm making. You see, what I'm suggesting is you shouldn't think of this as two different sets, two different events. There's a single event of you're trying to raise your arm, and that single event has a level of description where it is a matter of physiological changes taking place in your brain, of neurobiological processes in the brain going all the way to the muscle fibers. Okay, I'm going to go on now, and I was going to spend a couple minutes at the beginning of this lecture, but this is kind of worth going over this material because it's crucial for the whole course. But we were at the very end last time. I was telling you about the features of consciousness, and I think the way to do this is, if you can, try to forget about the history of the subject and just describe your own experiences. And what you will find is your conscious states have the following characteristics. They are, first of all, qualitative. They have this qualitative character that there's always some particular quality to having any qualitative, and if you like abstract nouns, you can make that qualitativeness, but it's got too many syllables for me. But in any case, that conscious states are qualitative. Now, some philosophers like to use the word qualia, and that's another term you will see in the literature for conscious states, and that's the plural. The singular is quale, one quale, two qualia. It's from the Greek. I don't have any use for the notion of qualia because all conscious states are qualitative. The idea that a lot of people have is, well, drinking beer, that's qualia. Feeling a pain, listening to music, those are qualia. But just thinking, there's no qualitative feel to thinking. I think there is. I think thinking 2 + 2 = 4 has a certain qualitative feel, and you can see that if you, as I mentioned before, if you think it in different languages. Zwei und zwei sind vier feels to me different from thinking 2 + 2 = 4, and I won't bore you by going through French and Spanish and Portuguese, but try it out with languages, you know. So every conscious state has a qualitative structure, and for that very reason, it's subjective ontologically. That is to say, it only exists insofar as it is experienced. It has ontological subjectivity, and it comes to us in a unified form. I don't just have the taste of beer and the sound of the music, but I have both the taste of the beer and the sound of the music as part of a single unified conscious experience. And I argued very briefly, I just said it, I didn't really argue for it, and that is, if you think about these are really just one. A qualitative subjective unity or unified qualitative subjectivity, that's a single feature of consciousness with these aspects. Why do I say that? Because each of these implies the next. It couldn't be qualitative in that sense if it wasn't subjective. And it couldn't have qualitative subjectivity if it wasn't unified, if it didn't come to you in these unified chunks. And that's why the split brain cases are so interesting to us, and I mentioned them briefly as well, where the patient apparently has two centers of consciousness going on simultaneously. Okay, the fourth feature was intentionality, and I'm going to talk about that in detail, so I won't talk about it now. It's just to say, from an evolutionary point of view, the single most important feature of our consciousness is its capacity to relate us to the environment, to find food, to reproduce, to enable ourselves to survive under adverse conditions. To do those, you've got to have a way of representing how things are in the world, how you're going to make them be, how you want them to be, etc. So that's intentionality. Now, it's also the case that all of our conscious states come to us in some mood or other. It needn't be a mood that has a name, like being depressed or being elated. But clearly there is a mood. Moods are not the same as emotions, though the moods may predispose you to an emotion. If you're in an irritable mood, that may have you more tendency to become angry. Anger is a form of intentionality. Irritability is not, because you can be irritable without being irritated about anything specific. In the case of anger, what are you angry about must always make sense. There has to be an answer to that question. But if the guy's just grumpy, he needn't be grumpy about anything. Or if he's just irritable, he needn't be irritated about anything. Okay, another crucial distinction in the case of consciousness is the distinction between the center and the periphery of consciousness. There are all sorts of things that are part of my conscious field that I'm not paying any attention to. So, for example, as I walk around on this floor, there are various lines in the linoleum, but I'm not paying any attention to those lines, or the specific distance between the fluorescent lights. Those are all part of my conscious experience. I could focus my attention on them, but I am not focusing my attention on them. And the whole point about the center is that the center is where we're focusing our attention. The metaphor of the searchlight, I think, is almost inevitable. You sort of shine the searchlight of your intention by focusing on certain aspects of your consciousness and not others. But you can be conscious of lots of things that you're not paying attention to. The feeling of the shirt on my back, or the particular texture of the chalk in my hands, those are all part of my conscious field, but they're not at the center. Now, related to this, but I think not really the same, is the sense in our conscious states that there are a certain boundary conditions on the conscious states that they are situated. And I'll just have an ugly word, call that situatedness. That in the case of my consciousness, though it's not really part of the conscious field, I have the conscious field as situated in space and time in a certain way. So, for example, I know what month we're in. I know if it's after breakfast or before breakfast. And one of the odd forms of disorientation you will experience as you get older is that you can have this kind of disorientation where you wonder, well, what the hell month are we in? Are we in the spring semester or the fall semester? And you do have this sense of a discombobulation when you lose the situatedness. This is really not either the center or the periphery, but if this is your conscious state, and this is what you're focusing your attention on, all the same, you know what's going on out here. I now know that I'm in the United States, that I'm in Berkeley, California, that it's after breakfast, that we're in the latter part of the month of February. All of those have to do with the situatedness of my conscious states. And I think that's separate from the center-periphery distinction. Okay, now a crucial feature of consciousness is I think every conscious state comes to us with the pleasure-unpleasure dimension. It's a bit unfortunate that we oppose pleasure and pain because there are all sorts of unpleasures that are not actually painful. And what I'm getting at is this. For every conscious state, it always makes sense to ask such questions as, was it fun? Did you enjoy it? Did you have a good time? Was it boring, amusing, exasperating, horrible, ecstatic, or just plain blah? Any conscious experience. Somebody went to the party, or they spent a weekend in Sausalito, and it always makes sense to ask, well, did you have a good time? Was it fun? Were you happy during that period? And I think this is true of consciousness in general, and it's presumably, again, plays a crucial role in the evolutionary function of consciousness, is that we are attracted by pleasure and we resist pain and other forms of unpleasure. So any conscious state will be situated on the pleasure-unpleasure dimension. All right, let me stop for questions about that because I want to mention some other features of consciousness. And I've given you a whole lot of features. Any questions about this list of 8? I'm going to get about a dozen of these out before we stop if I have time. Yes?
So far, real fast, consciousness and intention, they are pretty much, intention is actually a vehicle to consciousness.
No, there are lots of conscious states that have no intentionality. So, for example, a mood typically does not have intentionality. If you ask people, well, you seem to be anxious, what are you anxious about? There may be no answer to that. I don't know, I'm just jumpy. I'm not anxious about anything in particular. Similarly with even certain forms of depression. You can be depressed, you're just down in the dumps. Or elation. People get in an elated mood. Oh, I feel great today. What do you feel great about? Nothing special. I just feel great. In fact, there was a time in this university, I'm sure that's not true of you, when some of my students would inject chemical substances in their bodies for the purposes of producing what they called feelings of well-being. I think these were by and large not intentional. It wasn't that they suddenly decided they felt good about the revolution in Egypt. They just liked to feel good, and so they took various feel-good substances. But there was no intentionality involved. These were sometimes described as mood-altering. They were down here. They were not at the level of the intentionality. Now, I gave a lecture about this stuff to a bunch of psychoanalysts once, and they said, well, that's our job, actually, is to take the undirected anxiety and find the actual intentional object. That when you have an intentional state when you have a conscious state without any intentionality, there's really some unconscious intentionality, and the psychoanalyst has to find that very intentionality. I was reminded of Freud saying that the aim of psychoanalysis is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary human unhappiness. And I guess maybe that's not a bad description. Neurotic misery usually lacks a well-defined intentionality, but with ordinary human unhappiness, you normally know what you're unhappy about. So not all consciousness is intentional. There are all sorts of conscious states that lack. There's no answer to the question, what's it about? Whereas others, there has to be something that it's about. I mean, if you have fear or pride or shame or belief or desire or intention, there has to be a content. There has to be an answer to the question, well, what is it exactly that you believe? A guy can't say, I woke up believing today. And I say, well, what did you believe? You didn't believe anything. It's a free country. I just wanted to believe, so I just believed. Well, but you got to believe something. No, not in California. Okay, that won't do. There has to be a content. There has to be an answer to the question, what exactly do you believe? And you're going to hear more about the nature of intentionality. Yes?
Can you log situated this again?
Yeah. Okay, let me say a little more about that. A lot of the features of consciousness are not immediately present. In the sense that it's what you're thinking about when you're conscious. Nonetheless, it is a feature of my conscious state that it occurs to me as occurring in a certain spatio-temporal and social context. I didn't say anything about the social. Now, the spatio-temporal is easy. I'm not thinking right now, I'm in Berkeley. Berkeley's in California. California's on. I don't have to think any of that crap. But all the same, that's sort of my background knowledge. I have this consciousness. I'm lecturing on the philosophy of mind in Northgate in the University of California. And all of that goes on with a sense of its situatedness. This is occurring in the latter days of February in the second decade of the 21st century. All of that is part of the background situatedness of my consciousness, but it's not part of the actual content of the consciousness. Now, another feature that we're going to get to of the situatedness, where it's not actually what you're paying attention to, it's not actually part of the conscious field, but it's a condition on the conscious field, and I might as well mention it now, and that is the sense of the self. It isn't just that I'm having these conscious states, but I have them as my conscious states. Now, what the hell does that mean? You see, Hume taught us that you have no experience of the self And I think he's right about that. You know, if I ask myself, what am I really? And I grab my forehead and ask, what do I experience really? What I experience is some fist is grabbing the top of my forehead and I'm pulling at my skin. And it happens to be my fist. But there is no separate experience of the self. All the same, I want to say, these conscious experiences do have a characteristic, namely, they come to me as part of my life history. They are my conscious experiences. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to talk about that when we get to the self. I think the self is kind of a sordid subject in philosophy, but I don't think we can really do without it. I think we do need a notion of the self. Okay, let me mention just a couple of other features. A remarkable feature of our consciousness is its capacity to organize our diverse stimuli into meaningful units. And I gave you this example where it doesn't really look like a face, but your brain will organize it into a face. It'll get a meaningful unit out of what is, in fact, just a bunch of lines on a blackboard. That the brain has the capacity to organize your consciousness into meaningful wholes. Gestalt is the German word for form. And your experiences, your conscious experiences come to you in meaningful forms. And there's a whole lot of research on this about how perception is a function of expectations. But there are historical events that bear this out. When Captain Cook sailed into Sydney Harbor, the natives paid no attention. You know, okay, so these dumb clouds on the water. They literally couldn't see his boats because their previous experience didn't allow for that kind of thing. But when men got over the side of the boats and appeared in little boats, which they could identify as fellow human beings, then they panicked. Then the consciousness organized the experience in a way that was meaningful to them. So perception is a function of expectation, and your expectations will be a function of all what I'm going to later call your set of beliefs as well as your background knowledge, your background ways of coping. We could keep going with these all day, but I want to mention one last one before we stop, and that is, it seems to me there's clearly a distinction between passive versus active consciousness. In the case of active consciousness, you have a sense of you are doing something, you are acting. In the case of passive consciousness, you have a sense of this is happening to me. The classic distinction, of course, is between voluntary action, where you have an active consciousness, and perception, where it's just perceptual. These, of course, lock together. I mean, you don't have any actions without perceptions, and for humans, most perceptions are related to actions, either actions you can perform or actions you are performing. This is why we have a problem of the freedom of the will, but we do not have a problem of the freedom of digestion or the freedom of perception. Somebody can say, I believe in the freedom of digestion. I can digest any damn thing I want. Or the freedom of perception. We don't have those problems. We do have a problem of freedom of the will, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, let's stop here. Be sure to give me your sheets.